In the vast silence of the frontier, where the land was harsh and every meal hard-earned, the measure of a man was rarely found in his words but in the quiet labor of his hands. The cowboy knew this truth well. Each day, beneath the sun that burned the plains, he worked until his back ached and his skin bore the marks of sacrifice. And when the evening came, he brought home what little he could, a loaf of bread, simple but honest, carved out of sweat and endurance. Yet instead of gratitude, his wife's eyes wandered back to the grand feast her father once laid upon their table. Her words, sharp and unguarded, cut deeper than any outlaw's knife. She compared the modest bread to the lavish meals of her childhood, dismissing the effort that placed it upon the table. To her, it was not abundance, it was lack. But in the Old West, where survival was never promised, a loaf of bread was not just food. It was a testimony of resilience, of long hours against the unforgiving land, of a man's silent vow to provide against every hardship. Still, her comparison reduced his gift to a shadow of what she believed she had lost. The cowboy said nothing. Silence was his armor, his language, his way of carrying wounds that words could never mend. But inside, the sting of her dismissal lingered, not because of the bread, but because of what it symbolized. In her eyes, his sacrifice seemed smaller than another man's wealth. And in that moment, he felt the heavy truth of the West, that some battles were not fought with guns or fists, but with the crushing weight of being unseen, unvalued, and unrecognized. Around them, the town whispered as it always did. Neighbors saw the tension, though few dared to speak of it. To them, the cowboy was a man of quiet strength, steady as the land itself. But behind closed doors, even the strongest spirit could be shaken by the simple yearning to be enough in the eyes of the one they loved. The bread was not just food, it was love shaped in the only way he knew how to give it. Yet love, when measured against wealth, often appears small to those who have never carried its weight. Still, the cowboy endured, as he always had. The West had taught him that storms passed, that land yielded only to persistence, and that dignity was not found in what others compared, but in what a man knew within his soul. And though his wife's words cut deep, the truth of his sacrifice remained unbroken. For sometimes, the humblest offering carries more power than the grandest feast, if only the eyes receiving it can see beyond the hunger of pride. The next morning, the cowboy rose before the sun, as he always did. His hands, cracked and worn from years of labor, reached for the tools that had become an extension of his very being. The land was dry, the soil unforgiving, and each harvest felt like a battle fought with sweat instead of bullets. Yet he carried on, because duty was not measured in comfort, but in sacrifice. Each loaf of bread he brought home bore the story of this struggle, though his wife could not see it past the shadow of her father's abundance. She sat at the table, her eyes distant, recalling the long feasts of her childhood where roasted meat filled platters and wine poured without end. The simple bread before her seemed to mock those memories, a reminder of how far she had fallen from what once was. In comparing her husband's offering to her father's wealth, she saw scarcity, not devotion. But the West did not deal in feasts, it dealt in survival, and survival was not always enough for a heart still yearning for the past. The cowboy heard her sighs, her quiet complaints, though she never raised her voice. His silence, though steady, was heavy. Each word left unspoken weighed upon him, like a stone in his chest. He wondered if his love, measured in calloused hands and weary shoulders, would ever be seen for what it truly was. In the West, men could tame horses and face outlaws, but the one fight they could not win was the battle against the longing in another's heart. Neighbors began to notice the strain. They admired the cowboy's endurance, but whispers grew about his wife's dissatisfaction. Some pitied him, others judged her, and in a town where gossip carried like wind across the plains, their home became the quiet subject of many evenings. Still, the cowboy never faltered. He carried his bread each night as if it were a treasure, hoping one day she might see it not for what it lacked, but for what it meant. And yet, deep down, the widow's daughter, now a wife, did not realize she was holding more than bread. She was holding the very essence of the West, sacrifice dressed in simplicity, love hidden in silence, and dignity carved out of hardship. But until her heart shifted, the bread would remain nothing more than a reminder of what she thought she had lost, rather than the gift of what she truly had. As the days passed, the contrast between memory and reality grew sharper. The wife often spoke of her father, not with anger, but with longing, as if his shadow still lingered over her table. She would describe the way he presided over grand meals, how neighbors and family gathered in laughter, and how every plate was filled without fear of running empty. To her, those were the marks of a man's greatness. Compared to that, the cowboy's bread seemed small, even invisible. The cowboy listened in silence, though each word left a scar. He respected her father's memory, yet could not ignore how it overshadowed his own quiet efforts. In the Old West, men were measured not only by their land but by how they provided for their families. And though he gave all he had, the constant comparisons made him question if his sacrifice would ever be enough. Pride and love wrestled within him, and though he never raised his voice, the hurt was written in the lines of his face. But the land itself seemed to understand him. Each evening, as he rode home across the fields, the wind carried with it a reminder that greatness in the West was never about excess. It was about endurance. Bread may not fill a table like a feast, but it filled his stomach, and more importantly, it proved that even in scarcity, life endured. The cowboy's gift was not grandeur. It was survival wrapped in quiet devotion. Still, the wife struggled to see it. Her heart was torn between gratitude and disappointment, between love for her husband and longing for her father's legacy. She wanted to honor the man she had married, but her words betrayed her discontent. And in every sigh, in every whispered comparison, she unknowingly pushed him further into silence. For the cowboy, words had always been few, but now, even fewer remained. Yet in the eyes of the townsfolk, some began to see what his wife could not. They admired how he bore her words without anger, how he continued to bring his bread with steady hands, never faltering in his duty. To them, that silence was not weakness, it was strength. And though the wife could not yet see it, the story of her husband's bread was already becoming something greater than any feast her father had ever given, a lesson in love, dignity, and endurance written in the language of the West. The turning of seasons brought no ease to the cowboy's burden. Summer's heat dried the earth, and winter's frost hardened it. Yet he returned to the fields each day with the same steady resolve. His back bent, his hands blistered, but his will never broke. When he placed bread on the table, it was no longer just bread. It was proof that he had wrestled with the land itself and come out with something to sustain them. But still, in his wife's eyes, the loaf seemed smaller than the memory of her father's banquets. At night, she sometimes cried softly, believing he was asleep. Her tears weren't born of hatred, but of disappointment, of a longing for a life she believed she had lost. She did not see that the cowboy's silence was not emptiness, but a choice to shield her from his own pain. His love was hidden in the sacrifices he made, sacrifices she had never been forced to witness in her father's house of plenty. Where her father had shown abundance, her husband showed endurance. The cowboy began to wonder if his silence was protecting her or slowly eroding their bond. He did not blame her for her memories. The heart often clings to what was easy when faced with the weight of hardship. But as the days wore on, he feared that no matter how many loaves of bread he brought, they would never outweigh the echo of feasts that once were. That fear, though unspoken, gnawed at him more than hunger ever could. Neighbors, though they never dared to intrude, saw the change in him. His shoulders, once straight with quiet pride, now slumped ever so slightly under the weight of unseen burdens. Yet even in his weariness, he kept working. The townsfolk whispered of his loyalty, of how he bore more than most men would tolerate. They began to admire the bread, not for its size, but for the heart it represented. Slowly, his silent struggle began to take root in the stories passed between neighbors. And though his wife could not yet see it, the truth was becoming clear to those who watched. Her father's feasts were moments of pride, but her husband's bread was a lifetime of devotion. And in the Old West, where survival itself was a victory, devotion mattered more than gold, more than cattle, more than the fleeting abundance of a feast. One evening, after a long day under the burning sun, The cowboy placed another loaf of bread upon the table. His wife looked at it, and for a moment, her heart ached. She wanted to feel gratitude, but the memory of her father's endless table rose unbidden in her mind once again. She sighed, and though she said nothing, the sound was louder than any words could have been. The cowboy lowered his eyes, understanding more from her silence than from speech. That night, unable to sleep, she walked to the window and looked out at the darkened fields. She saw the silhouette of her husband still outside, tending to a broken fence long after the world had gone quiet. He moved slowly, his body weary, yet he worked with the same determination as always. For the first time, she wondered what kind of man carried that much weight without complaint, and whether her comparisons had blinded her to the truth of who he was. The next morning, she overheard neighbors speaking in the market. They praised her husband for his endurance, for the bread he brought despite the harsh land. One woman, whose own husband had abandoned her when crops failed, said softly, "Bread may be small, but it is steadier than feasts that vanish." The wife froze, realizing that what she dismissed as lacking was, to others, a rare treasure, a man who stayed, who fought for every crumb, who endured. That evening, as he placed bread on the table once more, she studied his hands. They were scarred, rough, worn by years of giving without asking in return. She thought of her father's hands, smooth, always lifted in gestures of command, never stained with soil. In that moment, the truth struck her. Her husband's bread was not smaller than her father's feast. It was larger because it was born from love, not pride. Tears filled her eyes, though she said nothing. For the first time, she took the bread with both hands and held it gently, as though she finally understood the weight it carried. And though she had yet to speak her realization, the silence between them was different now. Not heavy, not bitter, but slowly shifting towards something tender, something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The days stretched into weeks, and with each passing dawn, the wife began to notice details she had once overlooked. She saw the way her husband rose before the rooster crowed, the way he rode out into the biting wind without hesitation, and how he returned each evening with shoulders heavy but eyes steady. The bread he placed on the table no longer looked small to her. It looked like a victory pulled from the hands of an unforgiving land. Each loaf was a reminder that her life was held together by his quiet determination. One night, as the wind howled across the plains, she listened to the cowboy's steady breathing beside her. For the first time in many months, she felt guilt pressing on her heart. She had measured him against memories of a man long gone, failing to see the one who stood beside her, flesh and blood, enduring each hardship for her sake. The comparison that once seemed natural now felt cruel, a wound she had unknowingly opened again and again. The cowboy, though he never spoke of it, felt a shift. There was something gentler in the way she looked at him, something softer in her eyes when he returned at dusk. She still carried the ache of what she had lost, but now she seemed to see the worth in what she had. For a man of few words, that change was worth more than any feast, for it meant his silence had not been in vain. The town, too, began to change in how it saw them. The story of the cowboy who brought bread while his wife yearned for feasts had spread, but now it was told with respect. People spoke less of her longing and more of his devotion, and in their admiration, the wife heard truths she had missed. She realized that wealth could fill tables with food, but only love could fill them with meaning. One evening, when he placed the bread down as he always did, she touched his hand and whispered, "This is more than enough." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of all she had left unsaid. For the cowboy, it was not just an answer to his silence. It was the recognition his heart had quietly longed for, a sign that at last she saw him for who he truly was. But the Old West was not kind enough to let peace last forever. That year, the rains came late, and the land cracked beneath the sun's merciless glare. Crops failed across the valley, and even the wealthiest ranchers found their tables empty. The grand feast her father once hosted became a fading memory, for even the rich could not command the clouds to open. Hunger swept through the town, humbling even those who had once mocked simplicity. The cowboy, though weary, did not give up. He walked farther into the plains, hunted where others feared to go, and bartered his last possessions to bring home whatever he could. Some nights, it was nothing more than half a loaf, but it was still something. The wife, now seeing with new eyes, understood the magnitude of each piece of bread. No feast in the world could compare to the devotion that fought for her survival when the earth itself turned against them. Neighbors began to knock on their door, seeking help, and though they had little, the cowboy shared what he had. The wife watched in silence as the bread she once scorned became salvation for others. She saw the gratitude in their eyes, the tears of mothers who had nothing left to give their children. In that moment, her husband's offering was transformed from a symbol of lack into a symbol of grace, generosity, and quiet heroism. Her heart shifted completely. Where once she had compared him to her father's abundance, she now saw him as greater. Her father's feasts had been fleeting, tied to wealth and circumstance, but her husband's bread was eternal, born from sacrifice, sustained by love, and shared even in scarcity. It was not the table filled with endless dishes that made a man great, but the willingness to give even when little remained. As the season dragged on, the wife began to walk beside him, helping where she could, no longer a spectator to his struggle, but a partner in it. Together, they endured what others could not, their bond forged in fire and hunger. And though the land remained cruel, their home grew stronger, not because of what it lacked, but because of what it held, a love that no feast could ever rival. The drought deepened, turning the earth to dust and cracking even the strongest hands that tilled it. Each day was harder than the last, yet the cowboy remained relentless. His wife, now by his side in the fields, began to see with her own eyes what his silence had always concealed: the endless labor, the constant fight against nature itself. The bread they brought home now came from both their hands, and in its simplicity, she felt pride rather than shame. One evening, as they shared a crust by lamplight, the wife remembered the feasts of her father once more. But instead of longing, she felt a strange distance from those memories. Those tables had been full of food, yes, but they had been empty of sacrifice. What she now held, though meager, was sacred. Every bite carried the taste of endurance, of love proven not in abundance, but in persistence. She realized, with tears in her eyes, that the bread was not smaller than the feast. It was greater. The townsfolk began to notice the change. Where once they had seen a dissatisfied wife, they now saw a woman transformed, her head lifted high as she walked beside her husband. Her presence in the fields silenced gossip, and slowly, respect began to replace judgment. In a land where weakness was scorned, her choice to share in his hardship made her strong in their eyes. Together, she and her husband became a picture of resilience. The cowboy felt the shift, too. His silence, once heavy, became lighter, no longer burdened by the sting of comparison. For the first time in years, he saw his wife's gaze not fixed on the past but on him, steady and true. That look, more than words, told him he had finally been seen, not as less than another man, but as enough. And, for a cowboy of few words, that was the only answer he had ever needed. In the Old West, survival was not just about enduring the land, but about enduring one another. And in that endurance, bonds were either broken or forged stronger than steel. Theirs, tested by silence, longing, and hunger, had been reforged into something unshakable, proof that love, when rooted in sacrifice, could outlast even the cruelties of the desert sun. Yet hardship in the West always carried new trials. One evening, word spread that cattle thieves had struck nearby, raiding ranches and leaving families with nothing. Fear swept through the town, for loss of livestock meant starvation. The cowboy, though weary, prepared to guard what little they had. His wife, no longer blind to the weight he carried, stood beside him, refusing to retreat into fear. She had learned that dignity was not found in comfort, but in courage, even when danger loomed. The thieves came under moonlight, shadows moving swift and silent. The cowboy faced them, not with reckless bravado but with the steady calm that defined him. A man of few words, he let his actions speak, his stance, his unyielding gaze, his refusal to abandon what he had fought so hard to provide. His wife, though afraid, stood behind him, holding a lantern high, as if her very presence was a declaration that she, too, would not surrender to fear. The confrontation ended not in blood, but in retreat. The thieves, unnerved by the couple's resolve, slipped back into the darkness. The town awoke to the story of their defiance, and whispers spread quickly. The cowboy, already respected, was now spoken of as a man whose quiet strength could protect as much as provide. His wife, once pitied for her longing, was now admired for her courage to stand beside him. For her, the night was a revelation. She had once believed strength belonged to feasts and wealth, but she now understood it lived in the simple bread, in the scarred hands of her husband, in the silent bravery that held back fear even under threat. She realized that the feast she had longed for was not one of meat and wine, but of respect, loyalty, and the quiet love they now shared. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, the wife placed her hand on her husband's shoulder and whispered, "You are more than I ever saw before." He did not answer, only tipped his hat, but in his silence, she heard everything she had once missed. And together, they faced the rising sun, their bond stronger than any banquet, their love deeper than any memory of feasts past. The seasons turned once more, and though the land remained unforgiving, the couple's bond grew stronger than the hardships that surrounded them. Each day brought its share of struggle, yet within those struggles lay a quiet triumph. The wife no longer measured her life against the shadows of her father's feasts. Instead, she found meaning in the small victories, the loaf of bread on the table, the mended fence, the roof that kept out the rain. What once felt like scarcity now looked like abundance, because it was born from sacrifice and love. The cowboy, though still a man of silence, carried himself differently. His eyes, once clouded by the weight of unseen wounds, now held a glimmer of peace. He felt her presence in the fields, her hand steadying his when the work grew long, her voice gentle where once it had been distant. He no longer feared her comparisons, for he knew she had left them behind. And in that knowledge, his silence transformed, not heavy with unspoken hurt, but full of unspoken gratitude. The townsfolk, too, could see the change. Where once gossip had lingered, respect now blossomed. They spoke of the cowboy and his wife as an example of what the West demanded: endurance, loyalty, and the courage to stand together when the world tried to break them apart. Their story spread beyond the town, told around campfires and in trading posts, a reminder that greatness was not found in lavish banquets, but in the strength to endure life's hungers with dignity. The wife, reflecting on her journey, began to understand that her father's feasts had never truly been about love. They had been about display, about pride dressed as generosity. Her husband's bread, humble and unadorned, was love in its purest form. Every loaf was a vow, every crust a testimony, every crumb proof that even in the harshest land, love could survive. And once she saw this truth, she knew she would never again compare what she had to what once was. One evening, as they shared their meal in silence, the wife looked at her husband and whispered softly, "This bread is worth more than 100 feasts." The cowboy did not answer, but his hand, rough and scarred, closed gently over hers. In that silence, she heard the promise of all their tomorrows, hard perhaps, but together and enough. The years etched lines on their faces and silvered their hair, but their bond only deepened with time. The bread never grew larger, yet it never needed to. It was no longer a symbol of lack, but of abundance, the kind of abundance the West respected most: endurance. Through droughts, storms, and long winters, the couple stood side by side, proving that love measured in sacrifice could outlast even the cruelties of the land. Their children, once blind to the quiet strength of their father, began to see what the town already knew. They saw a man who had never wavered, who had given everything without complaint, who had stood tall not through wealth, but through resilience. And they saw a woman who had once compared him to another, but had learned, in the end, to honor him for what he truly was. Regret filled their hearts, but respect finally bloomed. The cowboy never sought recognition, yet it found him nonetheless. Stories of his steady devotion outlived him, passed down like legends of the Old West. They spoke not of a man who brought riches, but of a man who brought bread, and in that bread carried the weight of love, dignity, and survival. His silence became his legacy, one that taught others that true greatness was not loud, but steady. The wife, now older, often sat by the hearth and remembered the days when she had compared him to her father. Those memories no longer carried shame, but gratitude, for they had taught her to see the difference between fleeting pride and lasting devotion. She knew now that no feast could ever compare to the quiet strength of a man who gave all he had, day after day, without complaint. And so, their story became more than their own. It became a lesson whispered through the canyons and carried on the prairie wind, that in the Old West, as in life, the greatest love was not found in the abundance of a table, but in the endurance of a heart. The feast may fade, but the bread, the humble, hard-earned bread, remains forever enough. In the end, the story of the quiet cowboy and his bread was never about scarcity. It was about meaning. What began as a tale of comparison against a father's grand feast transformed into a lesson of love forged in silence, resilience carved out of hardship, and devotion that no wealth could ever measure. The bread, once dismissed, became the true feast, not of abundance on the table, but of endurance in the heart. Through their journey, we see that greatness is not always loud, and strength is not always displayed in lavish ways. Sometimes, it lives in the quiet sacrifices made each day, in the hands that labor without applause, and in the love that continues to give even when it is unseen. The cowboy's bread was never just food. It was a vow renewed each morning, proof that love can survive even when the land and life itself seem against you. The wife's transformation is a mirror for all of us. How often do we measure what we have against what we once knew, failing to see the treasure before our eyes? Her story reminds us that gratitude is not about comparing abundance, but about recognizing devotion. True richness lies not in overflowing tables, but in the steady presence of those who refuse to give up on us. That realization turned her sorrow into strength, her longing into respect. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is this: silence can speak louder than words. The cowboy did not argue, nor boast, nor seek recognition. He simply endured, and in his endurance, he revealed a truth that reshaped both his wife's heart and the eyes of the town. His bread, humble and hard-earned, became a symbol greater than any feast, a symbol of love that does not waver, no matter the season. If this story moved you, let it linger. Reflect on the bread in your own life, the quiet acts of love and sacrifice that may go unseen but are priceless. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let your voice add to this reflection. And if you wish to walk with us through more stories of the Old West, subscribe to the channel and keep this journey alive. Like the cowboy's silence, your engagement speaks louder than words, carrying these lessons farther than the wind across the prairie.